The room was silent after the final call. The receiver had gone dead, but the question remained. If every call came from the future, who made the first call? Nobody in the room had an answer. For several minutes, they simply stared at the black file. The same file that had connected every strange case now seemed to be pointing towards something much older, something that existed before the calls. They began with the obvious place, the records. Every call was listed in chronological order. The first known call, the second, the third. Then the call at 3:17. They compared dates, times, locations, and names. At first, the pattern seemed simple. Each call appeared to arrive before an important event. But then one investigator noticed something strange. The oldest recorded call was not actually the beginning. There was another reference hidden inside the file. A number, no date, no caller, no location. Just a single entry marked First Contact. They searched the archive for the number. Nothing appeared. They checked the original photographs. Nothing. They checked the audio recordings. Nothing. Then they opened the oldest document in the black file. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note. It contained only 6 words. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The message said, "The first call was never recorded." For the first time, they considered a possibility that changed the entire investigation. Maybe they had been searching for the wrong beginning. Maybe the first call was not missing from the records. Maybe someone had deliberately removed it. And if that was true, there was only one question left. Who knew about the first call before anyone else did? The answer seemed impossible. Because according to the file, someone had written about it before the investigation had even begun. The next morning, the black file was placed on the center of the evidence table. Every page was photographed. Every photograph was numbered. Every document was checked against the original archive. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been added. At least, that was what the investigators believed. They left the room just after midnight. The evidence room was locked. The cameras remained active. Nobody entered. At 7:40 the next morning, the investigators returned. The black file was exactly where they had left it. The seal was still intact. The pages were still in order. But one investigator noticed something immediately. There was a sentence on the final page. It had not been there the night before. No one had seen it. No one had written it. The sentence was only 7 words long. "You are looking in the wrong order." They checked the cameras. The room had remained empty all night. They checked the table. There were no fingerprints around the page. They checked the ink. It was fresh. That made no sense. The document itself was decades old, yet the handwriting looked as if it had been written minutes earlier. The investigator turned the page over. Nothing. He turned it back. The sentence was still there. Then something even stranger appeared. The page number had changed. It had originally been marked page 47. Now it read, page 1. They checked the previous photographs. Page 47 was clearly visible. The same page. The same handwriting. The same document. But in the new photograph, the page was numbered differently. They placed the 2 photographs side by side. The paper had not moved. The words had not changed. Only the number had changed. 47 had become 1. And suddenly, the message made sense. They had been reading the black file from the beginning, but perhaps the file itself had never been written in that order. The first page might not have been the first event. The final page might not have been the final event. The entire investigation could have been arranged backward. They began removing the pages, one by one. The deeper they went, the stranger the dates became. A document dated 1998 referred to an event from 2004. A photograph from 2004 contained an object that was not discovered until 2012. Then they found a report dated 2012. It mentioned the call from 317. But the call had supposedly happened years later. The room became silent again. The investigator looked at the black file, then at the photographs, then back at the sentence. "You are looking in the wrong order." For the first time, they wondered whether the file was not documenting the mystery. Maybe it was hiding it. And if the pages were being rearranged for a reason, there was only one question left. What would they find if they finally put the file in the correct order? They stopped looking at the pages as a story. They began treating them as evidence. Every date was removed. Every timestamp was recorded. Every name was placed on a separate timeline. The calls were then arranged according to the moment they were received. At first, the pattern appeared normal. One call, then another, then another. each one connected to something that happened later. But when they reached the oldest record, the timeline broke. The first documented call had been received on October 14th. That was the earliest confirmed date, but the report connected to it contained a reference to a conversation from October 11th. There was no recording of that conversation. No phone log, no witness statement, nothing. They searched the archive again. Then they found a second reference. A report from October 9 mentioned a caller asking about an event that had not happened until October 14. The investigators stared at the document. The date was undeniable. October 9. 5 days before the first known call. They checked the original paper. It was genuine. They checked the archive scan. It matched perfectly. Then they checked the author. The person who wrote the report had retired years earlier. He had never mentioned the black file. He had never mentioned the calls. So why had he written about one before it happened? They searched his old records. There was one surviving interview. It had been recorded shortly after the investigation began. The investigator played the audio. The man's voice was calm. He said he remembered receiving a strange phone call, but he could not remember the exact date. Then he gave them a number, the same number that appeared beside the words "first contact." The room went quiet. They had finally found the number, but there was still no caller. They traced the number through old telephone records. It had never been assigned. Not to a house, not to an office, not to a public telephone. It did not exist in the system. Yet someone had used it. They went back to the original report. There was one final detail they had missed. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten timestamp. 0317. The same time. Again. The investigator slowly looked toward the black file. The calls were not simply predicting events. They were connected to the same time. And now they had found something even worse. The earliest reference to the calls happened before the first call was supposed to exist. Then the printer beside them suddenly started. No one had touched it. A single sheet came out. It contained only one sentence. The first call was answered. The investigator picked up the paper. His hands stopped moving. Because beneath the sentence was a name. His own. The name on the paper belonged to the investigator. He stared at it for several seconds. Then he turned the sheet over. Nothing. No explanation. No signature. No date. Just his name. He immediately checked the printer. The machine was connected to the evidence room computer. The print history showed no new document. According to the system, nothing had been printed. Yet the paper was still in his hand. They checked the surveillance footage. At 3:17 that morning, the printer had remained completely still. No paper came out. No one entered the room. There was no explanation. Then they compared the new page with the black file. The handwriting was identical, not similar. Identical. The same pressure, the same spacing, the same strange shape of the letter T. Someone had written the message, but nobody knew when. They returned to the old report. The investigator's name was not there. That should have been impossible. He had joined the investigation only recently. The original document had been written decades before, yet the new page seemed to connect him directly to the first call. They searched his personal records. Nothing. No connection. No previous involvement. No reason for his name to appear in the file. Then another contradiction appeared. The original report listed the first call as unanswered, but an older handwritten note said, the call was answered. 2 records. Same case. Same call. Opposite conclusions. They began checking every previous call. The pattern became disturbing. Every official report said one thing. The handwritten notes said another. The official records described what investigators believed had happened. The handwritten notes described what they would later discover. It was as if 2 versions of the same case existed. One written in the past, one written from somewhere else. Then they found the most important contradiction. The first call had supposedly been received by a woman named Eleanor Voss, but the original telephone record showed that Eleanor had died 3 days before the call. The investigators checked the death certificate. It was genuine. They checked the telephone line. It had been disconnected. There should have been no call, yet the recording existed. They played it again. Static. A faint breath. Then a voice. The voice said only one sentence. You already answered. The investigator froze. Because the voice sounded familiar. It sounded like him. They replayed it. Again. The same voice. The same words. Then the recording ended. Nobody spoke. The investigator looked at the black file. A new line had appeared on the final page. The first call was not to Eleanor. Underneath it was another sentence. It was to you. The room went completely silent. Because the investigator had never heard that call before, at least, he did not remember hearing it. And suddenly, the question from episode 5 changed. It was no longer, who made the first call? It was, who answered it? They searched the entire evidence room, every drawer, every cabinet, every archive box. They were looking for the original page that mentioned the first call. The page should have existed. The file number was present. The reference was present. But the page itself was gone. They checked the previous photographs. In the oldest photograph, there were 48 pages. In the current file, there were 47. One page had disappeared. They enlarged the photograph. The missing page was visible between two documents. Its number was page 12. They searched the file. Page 11, page 13. Nothing between them. Page 12 was gone. Then they noticed something in the photograph. A sentence was written across the missing page. They could not read all of it. Only the final line was visible. The first call will be answered at 3:17. They checked the date on the photograph. It had been taken years before the investigator joined the case. Yet the sentence appeared to describe him. They began searching the archive for another copy. After nearly an hour, they found a scanned version. The page was there, but the scan was different. The sentence had changed. Now it said, the first call was answered at 3:17. They compared the two versions. Same document, same page number, same date. Different sentence. That should not have been possible. They checked the metadata. The scan had been created 12 years earlier. The photograph had been taken 14 years earlier. But the wording in the newer scan described something that had not happened until much later. They printed the scan. Then something strange happened. The printer stopped. The screen displayed one message. Document updated. The investigator looked back at the black file. Page 12 was suddenly there. Nobody had placed it inside. He slowly pulled it out. The paper felt warm. The page contained only 3 lines. 3:17. The call is coming. Do not answer. The investigator looked at the clock. 3:16. They had less than a minute. No one moved. The room became painfully quiet. At 3:17, the phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Nobody touched it. The ringing stopped. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the black file opened by itself. The pages moved slowly. They stopped at page 12. The message had changed. Now there was only one sentence. You answered it years ago. The investigator looked at the others. He knew what they were going to ask. He knew because suddenly, he remembered something. A phone ringing in a dark room, a voice on the other end, a clock showing 3:17, and his own voice saying, hello. But he had no memory of when it happened. Then the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed something impossible. Black file. The phone continued ringing. Nobody touched it. The caller ID remained unchanged. Black file. The investigator stared at the screen. A file could not make a phone call. But the phone was ringing. Again. And again. Then the clock changed. 3:17. The ringing stopped. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the phone screen lit up. A new call appeared. Missed call, 3:17. The investigator checked the call history. There was no incoming number, no network record, no carrier information, only one entry. Black file. He opened the voicemail. At first, there was silence, then breathing. Slow, calm, very close to the microphone. A voice finally spoke. It was his voice. Do not open the next page. The recording ended. Nobody moved. The investigator looked at page 12, then at the rest of the file. There was now another page beneath it. A page that had not been there seconds earlier. Its number was 13. The warning had been clear. Do not open it. He opened it. The page contained a photograph. It showed the evidence room. The same table. The same black file. The same investigators. But something was wrong. The photograph had been taken from inside the room. Behind them. Nobody had been standing there. The timestamp was printed beneath the image. 3:17 a.m. They checked the security footage. At that exact moment, the cameras showed an empty room. The investigators were not there. The table was empty. The black file was closed. But the photograph showed them standing around it. The investigator enlarged the image. His face became visible. He was looking directly toward the camera. His mouth was open, as if he was speaking. They enhanced the photograph. A few words became readable. His lips appeared to form a sentence. "You should have listened." The investigator stepped away from the screen. Then he noticed something else. In the photograph, the black file was already open, at page 14. They looked at the physical file. Page 14 did not exist. There were only 13 pages. The investigator began counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. He reached the end. 13. Then he looked again. A new page was appearing beneath his hand. Slowly, as if the file itself was producing it, the number appeared first, 14. Then words began forming underneath, one line at a time. The first call was not made. The investigator stopped breathing. Another line appeared. It was returned. Then the final sentence appeared. Someone called back. The phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed a name. The investigator's name. He answered. There was silence. Then a voice whispered, "You were the first." The line disconnected. He lowered the phone, and for the first time, nobody was looking at the file. They were looking at him. Because they all understood the same thing. The mystery was no longer asking who made the first call. It was asking whether the investigator himself had started it. The room remained silent after the call ended. Nobody wanted to say what they were thinking. The investigator placed the phone back on the table. His hands were shaking. He looked at the black file. Page 14 was still open. The message remained unchanged. The first call was not made. It was returned. The investigator asked them to play the recording again. The voice came through the speaker. His voice. There was no doubt now. Same tone. Same breathing pattern. Same slight pause before the final words. "You were the first." They checked the audio against his voice from an earlier interview. The recordings matched. Not perfectly, but closely enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then they discovered something worse. The voice on the mysterious recording was older. His voice sounded deeper, slower, as if the recording had been made years later. They checked the file metadata. The recording had no creation date. Only one timestamp existed, 0317. The investigator asked for the original telephone records. They found them. There was an incoming call at 317, but there was no caller number. The line had connected for 11 seconds, then disconnected. The investigator looked at the date. It was the same date as the first documented incident, but there was something strange about the recipient. The call had not been made to Eleanor Voss. It had been made to a number that did not exist. They traced the number. It belonged to an old evidence room, the same room they were standing in. Everyone went quiet. The first call had apparently been made to the black file, but the black file was not a phone. It had never owned a telephone line. Then the investigator noticed a handwritten note beneath the telephone records. It contained only one sentence. The file was the recipient. They checked the original evidence photograph. The black file was sitting beside the telephone. The receiver was off the hook. Nobody had noticed it before. The investigator zoomed in. There was a small piece of paper beside the phone, a handwritten number. It was the same impossible number from the first contact record. They entered it into the phone. Nothing happened. Then the phone rang. The screen displayed, calling, not incoming. Outgoing. The phone was calling the number by itself. The investigator watched the timer begin. 1 second. 2. 3. Then someone answered. There was no voice, only breathing. The investigator whispered, "Who is this?" A pause. Then the voice answered. His own voice. "You already know." The call ended. At that exact moment, page 14 disappeared. A new page appeared. Page 1. The investigator looked at the file. The entire sequence had changed again. The pages were no longer numbered in chronological order. Page 14 had become page 1. The first page of the black file was now the conversation they had just heard. And beneath it was one final sentence. The first call has been found. But the investigator noticed something else. The sentence beneath it was different. It had been written in red ink. Now find the first caller. The room fell silent, because beneath that sentence was a photograph. It showed a man standing beside the black file. His face was turned away from the camera, but his clothes were unmistakable. They belonged to the investigator, and the photograph was dated, tomorrow. The photograph remained on the table. Nobody touched it. The investigator stared at the figure wearing his clothes. The face was hidden, but the jacket was unmistakable. It was the same jacket he was wearing now. He checked his sleeve. Same tear near the cuff. Same small mark on the pocket. The photograph was impossible. They examined the paper. It was real. They checked the camera information. There was no camera listed. They checked the date, tomorrow. The investigator finally asked the question nobody wanted to ask. Who took this? No one answered. 3 explanations remained. The first was simple. Someone was manipulating the investigation. Someone had access to the evidence room. Someone was changing the documents. Someone was creating the photographs. If that was true, the entire black file could be an elaborate deception. The second explanation was more complicated. The documents could have been planted years ago. The photographs could have been staged. The recordings could have been created in advance. Perhaps someone had been building this mystery for decades, waiting for the right people to find it. But there was one problem. The third explanation, the impossible one. The file might not be predicting the future. It might be receiving information from it. Nobody wanted to accept that possibility. So they tried to disprove it. They checked every document again. They searched for hidden electronic devices. Nothing. They scanned the pages for invisible ink. Nothing. They checked the walls. Nothing. They examined the phone. Nothing. There was no transmitter, no hidden camera, no wireless device, no obvious mechanism. Then they discovered something that destroyed the first explanation. The newest page contained information that only one person in the room knew. A private memory. Something the investigator had never told anyone. The page described a conversation he had with his father as a child. It gave the exact words, the exact room, even the position of the clock. Nobody else could have known. He read the page twice. Then he stopped. At the bottom was another sentence. You have been here before. He looked around the room. Something about the walls suddenly seemed familiar. The desk, the lamp, the old clock, the position of the telephone. He had never worked in this building before. Yet he remembered the room. Not as it was now, as it had been years earlier. He remembered standing beside the same desk. He remembered a phone ringing. He remembered answering it. And he remembered hearing his own voice. The memory lasted only a few seconds. Then it disappeared. The investigator stepped back. The others watched him. He said nothing. The black file opened again. A new page appeared. This time, the message was short. The file does not predict events. A second line appeared. It remembers them. The investigator stared at the words. That explanation created an even bigger problem. If the file remembered the future, then someone had already lived it. And if someone had already lived it, the person standing in the photograph tomorrow might not be a prediction. It might be a memory. The room went completely silent. Then the clock began moving. 3:16, 1 minute before the next change. And the final line appeared. Tomorrow has already happened. The sentence remained on the page. Tomorrow has already happened. Nobody spoke. The investigator looked at the photograph again. The date was still tomorrow, but now the photograph looked different. The man standing beside the black file was no longer wearing the same jacket. He was wearing a dark coat. The investigator looked down. He was wearing his jacket. He looked back at the photograph. The coat was gone. The figure had changed. Not the position, not the room, only the clothes. Then another detail changed. The clock in the photograph had originally shown 3:17. Now it showed 3:18. They checked the original photograph. It had been 3:17. The investigator took another photograph of it. The new photograph showed 3:18. The file was changing again. They placed both images beside each other. The original image showed an empty chair. The new image showed someone sitting in it. Nobody had entered the room. The chair was physically empty. But the photograph showed a person sitting there. The investigator zoomed in. The face was blurred. Then the image changed. The blur disappeared. It was him. Not the investigator as he looked now. An older version. The same face. The same eyes. But several years older. The room became silent. The investigator looked at the black file. Another page appeared. You are not reading the file. A second sentence appeared. The file is reading you. Then the dates began changing. The first call moved from 1998 to 2004. The second call moved from 2004 to 1998. The event connected to the third call disappeared completely. A photograph changed. A name vanished from a report. Then another name appeared. The investigation was rewriting itself. Not randomly. It was adjusting every time they discovered something new. They realized the horrifying possibility. The black file was not one fixed record. It was a record that responded to the people investigating it. Every discovery changed the past. Every change created a new version of the case. That explained the contradictions, the different dates, the missing pages, the impossible photographs, the voice recordings. They were not mistakes. They were different versions of the same mystery. But one question remained. Which version was real? The investigator turned to the oldest photograph. The man in the image had disappeared. Now the photograph showed an empty room. The black file was gone from the desk. They looked at the physical table. The file was still there. Then the lights went out. For 3 seconds, the room was completely dark. When the lights returned, the file was closed. The investigator opened it. Every page was blank. Every photograph was gone. Every name had disappeared. Only one page remained. Page 1. It contained a single sentence. You found the wrong ending. The investigator looked underneath it. There was another line. The real file has already left the room. He turned toward the door. It was still locked. The security camera showed nobody leaving. But when they checked the evidence table again, the black file was no longer there. Then the phone rang. The investigator answered. A voice whispered, "Look behind you." He turned. Nothing. Then he looked at the security monitor. The camera showed the room from above. Everyone was standing around the empty table, except one person. A man was standing behind the investigator, the same man from the photograph. The investigator slowly turned around. Nobody was there. He looked back at the monitor. The man was gone. And beneath the monitor, someone had written 3 words. It starts tomorrow. File. The room remained frozen. Nobody moved toward the door. Nobody touched the phone. The words beneath the monitor were still there. It starts tomorrow. The investigator looked at the empty evidence table. The black file was gone. For the first time since the investigation began, they had no physical evidence. Only photographs. Only recordings. Only memories that could no longer be trusted. They searched the entire building. Nothing. The file had disappeared without triggering a single camera. No door had opened. No alarm had sounded. No person had entered or left. It was simply gone. Then, just before dawn, the investigator returned to the evidence room alone. The lights were off. The building was silent. He placed the phone on the table. He checked the clock. 3:17. Nothing happened. Then the phone screen lit up. One new image had appeared. He opened it. It was a photograph of the evidence room. The same table, the same chair. But this time, the black file was sitting in the center. Beside it was another folder. The investigator zoomed in. The label became clear. Black File, Episode 7. He stared at it. The photograph was dated tomorrow. He checked the room. The table was empty. There was no second folder. Then another image appeared. The same photograph. But the folder was closer. Another image appeared, closer again. Then another, until the folder filled the screen. Across its cover were 4 words. The passenger nobody recorded. The investigator stepped away from the phone. He understood what the file was doing. It was not showing him what would happen tomorrow. It was showing him what had already happened tomorrow. A final page appeared on the table. He picked it up. There was no date, no signature, no explanation. Only one sentence. If you found this page, you have already made the call. The investigator looked at the phone. The screen showed a new outgoing call. The destination was the impossible number. The same number connected to the first contact. He had not touched the phone. The call timer started. 1 second, 2, 3. Then someone answered. The voice was his own. Older, calmer, almost exhausted. It said, "Do not try to stop the file." The investigator whispered, "Who are you?" Silence. Then the voice answered, "I am the reason it started." The call ended. The screen went black. The investigator looked down at the page. The final sentence had changed. It now read, "The first caller was you." He dropped the page. Then he noticed something beneath the table, a photograph. He picked it up. It showed the evidence room. The investigator was standing beside the black file. An older version of himself stood behind him. The photograph was dated tomorrow, But the most disturbing detail was not the date. It was the black file. It was open, and inside, it was a photograph of the investigator holding that exact photograph. The image continued inward, one photograph inside another, then another, a chain with no visible beginning. The investigator finally understood the question that had haunted the case since episode 5. If every call came from the future, who made the first call? The answer was not another person. It was not a stranger. It was not a machine. It was not even the black file. The first call had been returned from a future that already knew the investigation would happen. And somewhere inside that future, he had made the call himself. He looked toward the empty table. The lights flickered. The phone rang one final time. He did not answer. The ringing stopped. A message appeared on the screen. Episode 6 complete. Then, beneath it, the passenger has arrived. The screen went dark, and the black file was never found again.